You know, we know already for a long time that climate is changing. Wetlands are disappearing everywhere.
This was the reason of those drastic floods in Germany. There's a shortage of proper delivery of the scientific information.
I don't want to be a priest, because if we want to increase food production and decrease CO2 emission, how do we do that?
Hello everybody, welcome to my channel. I am Aleksandra, your personal green advisor. And today with me I have Henk Zingstra, my guest from Netherlands, associate expert from the Wetlands International, chairman of EUROSITE Planning Management Expert Group, and trainer at Wageningen University. There are any other statuses you wanted to share?
I'm retired. So after retirement I decided that it would be nice to continue working. So they invited me actually to become an associate expert for Wetlands International. And EUROSITE I still knew from the past also, when I was managing protected areas. And I'm still also an advisor to the working group on climate change of the Carpathian Convention.
Welcome, Henk. It is a pleasure to have you here with us. I'm actually very happy to catch you in Budapest for this couple of days. So can you please tell me a little bit about your experience in Netherlands? We were discussing that Henk is a professional of the wetland conservation. Can you please elaborate for our viewers, what is wetland, what is wetland conservation, why we need to conserve it, and why is it important?
Okay, yeah, wetlands. I have always difficulty to explain what wetlands are. But wetlands are basically areas where water is dominant. So it can be, of course, lakes, ponds, but it can also be marshes, and it can also be floodplains. So the areas bordering the river, where often the river is also flooded, and so it basically are areas where there is permanent or temporary water. And these wetlands are hugely important because of their biodiversity mostly, but also to make sure that we have fish and inland fish then, or freshwater fish, that we have drinking water, and that we can use sometimes this water for agriculture. So they are both important for food security and also for biodiversity.
But how crucial is this problem now in Netherlands of the wetland conservation? Because we keen on to see that in general, based on the geographical location, you don't have problems with wetlands there.
Yeah. Well, wetlands are disappearing everywhere, and that happens also in the Netherlands. Maybe not at the moment, but they have disappeared quite rapidly because they simply have been drained and pumped out the water to make these lands ready for agriculture. So you know our polders, they are famous, and they were all lakes in the past. But now you won't see water in it anymore. The polders are pumped empty already from the start of the 16th century. Because of the famous windmills. The windmills basically were functioning as pumping installations to pump out the water from the ponds, from the lakes, and then to make them ready for agriculture. So I would say, but now I'm guessing, but I think I'm not much beyond the truth that 80 to 90% of the wetlands in Netherlands also disappeared. Luckily, though, at the moment, since we all see the benefit of wetlands are being restored massively. So not only in the Netherlands, by the way.
That was actually my next question. What are the tools and methods of the wetland restoration? And what can you please explain? What does it mean, the wetland restoration? Maybe in some examples. We were discussing this sponge project with you recently. So
yeah, that's a nice example. When you will go to a river valley, any river valley, you will see that there's agriculture. In 80–90% of the cases, these river valleys are occupied by agriculture. And that can only happen, can only be the case when these valleys are, there are all these ditches and canals that make sure that the water is going away and that the farmer can farm. The disadvantage of this is that now with climate change you have these situations of huge big rainfalls in a very short period. And that and because of all the canals and the ditches, this rain that is falling is very quickly entering into the river. And that means that the river level is going up very quickly, and downstream there will be floods.
This was the reason of those drastic floods in Germany this year.
Exactly. Because these floods in Germany and Belgium, and to a lesser extent in the Netherlands, were not along the big rivers. They were along very small rivers, but with a high intensity of canals and ditches. And our sponges project is basically to restore, well, you know, a sponge, to restore the possibility of the landscape to capture the water again, to retain the water.
How you are planning to do that?
Well, that's not easy, of course. First of all, because the farmer would like to stay farming, continue farming. And when it is a sponge, the landscape is a sponge, it's difficult to maintain farming. But what basically, it's quite simple basically, is that you block all these canals and ditches so that the water is not flowing quickly to the river, but is retained in this valley, and that the valley is becoming a kind of a sponge that fills slowly up when the rain falls. And in that way, when it retains the water and stops the water from quickly flowing to the river, you prevent floods downstream, because not all the water is, then the landscape is slowly releasing the water into the river after the rains have stopped, and you get a slow release of the water downstream to the river. So we have tested that through modeling, and the models are very promising. But of course, yeah, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, I think. So we are looking for pilot areas to implement this, and one of those are in the Carpathians.
You mentioned the attitude towards the local population as the farmers who are performing the agriculture on these lands, that they won't be really up for doing it, because then they will lose some land where they could plant their crops.
Yeah.
So in general, I remember we were discussing with you the attitude of the people towards such projects and the wetland conservation and the climate change in general.
Mm-hmm.
And you said that after these floods in Germany, the mentality of the people drastically changed.
Yeah. You know, we know already for a long time that climate is changing, and that and it has been proven very clearly in the case of the floods in Germany. Science has been able to prove that this is caused by climate change. It's not a coincidence. It is caused by climate change. And we can talk and say, okay, climate change is going to make floods more often occurring, that we will have droughts, because strangely enough, we will have floods and droughts at the same time. And we can continue to warn about the impact of climate change, but when we don't see it, people don't believe it.
Mm-hmm.
Majority of people think, oh, well, yeah, climate change, okay, it's getting warmer, nice. You know, there are winners and losers in climate change also. And especially for the north of Russia, the conditions for producing crops is simply improving. But anyway, for let's say the vast majority of the European continent, things are getting worse. And what happened after the floods in Germany, to come back on that, is that people realized that it has an impact. It is visible. There were more than 360 deaths. The economic losses were immense. Houses, thousands of houses, are inhabited and just washed away. So it has a huge impact, and the costs are incredible, and billions of euros. So if we just now start simply by measures that are not very expensive, and of course we need to compensate the farmers in their income, and maybe we need to look for other forms of farming. But if we can compensate the farmers and we invest not so much money to restore the sponge capacity of the landscape, we prevent the damage and we prevent disasters to happen. So it's basically, it's not that difficult to prepare and adapt also to climate. Of course, we still need to stop the emission of CO2, because even if we would stop now, climate will still increase for the coming 30 years.
But that's what was my question about. You said the mentality changed, the people realized that the climate change is here. Did it push them to action?
Well, at least no. Action by the civilians, by the inhabitants, is difficult. They have big problems of coping with the impact of the floods. But we have had elections in Germany, and climate was basically one of the most important issues. And the fact that the big party, the Christian Democrats, lost is partly caused by the ineffectiveness of reacting on the floods. And people, I think voters, punished the ineffectiveness and the lack of concrete action. So I think, yeah, as a civilian, as a inhabitant of no matter what kind of country, our action, you can have a personal impact, of course, by your the way you consume and the way you live. But by voting, you have also an impact, of course, by choosing the right party.
I know you also had quite a big experience in the MENA countries, which is Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Morocco, and Palestine.
Yeah.
How is the situation there?
Yeah, these countries are really struggling with lack of water. Like southern Europe, like Spain and Portugal and southern Italy, less though, especially southern Spain, becoming deserts in the future. In those countries, in the northern African and Arabic world, you see that they are so much struggling to have sufficient water for their food production. And that was also the involvement I had in this project. The population is really skyrocketing, especially in Egypt, but also in the other Arabic countries. Water resources are decreasing. Food production has to go up. So how do you do that? And there's no simple answer to that. But it comes down to being very, very careful with the little amount of water that is falling. So creating ponds and wetlands to store water, which you can use then afterwards to flood or to irrigate agricultural land. And learn farmers to be very careful with the rain that is falling. It's basically was a task we had, and looking for techniques. How can we be how can we save as much water as possible to be used for food production? And especially in Egypt, that's a huge problem because the water Egypt is just simply depending on water coming down from the Nile, and there's less and less water coming down from the Nile, and the population is now nearly 100 million inhabitants, all living in the Nile Delta, where also the food has to be produced.
Currently, there is lots of these new waves of raising food, including these vertical gardens, which are using less land, less water, and somehow more efficient. Don't you think that technology will sooner or later help us to solve this issue?
Yeah, the future of agriculture is uncertain in which way it will develop. And this way of vertical farming is one of the solutions, I would say, for the food crisis in the world, because there's still the amount of people lacking sufficient food is increasing again, nearly to 1 billion. So hunger is the first sustainable development goal of the United Nations, to eradicate hunger. So this new, I mean, it's a very efficient way of producing food. The water is recirculated. Because it's a closed system, there's hardly chemicals being used. The food is growing on a substrate. There are no attacks from insects. So yeah, possibly, and I don't think you can grow a lot of barley or wheat in this way. But of course, vegetables are very promising to grow in this way. And you can also have cows in the vertical way, probably. I don't know what the technique will present us, but yeah, for vegetables this is very promising, and it's one way, because you have also agroforestry, you have ecological agriculture. They're all ways of making agriculture more sustainable and more taking care of water and biodiversity. And it will be a combination simply of various forms of agriculture. But the biggest problem is, of course, that agriculture is responsible for 35, maybe 40% of the total CO2 emission worldwide. And of that 35 to 40%, 60% comes from animal farming, from cows and pigs and so on. So if we want to increase food production and decrease CO2 emission, how do we do that?
We should stop the meat production, I guess.
If meat production, of course, is for the biggest part of the CO2 emission from agriculture is meat and dairy. But still, the way we farm is also responsible for it, because if you the way we farm at the moment with the bare soils, there's a lot of CO2 emitted simply from the soil, because it is bare, the sun is shining on it, and the organic material in the soil is simply releasing the CO2 by oxidation. So we also have to change, not only stop with animal farming, but also change the way we produce barley and all the grains. And that can be done by agroforestry, for instance, or other forms for agriculture.
I want to ask you to go a little bit aside from the topic of agriculture.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to ask you the question about the delivery of the scientific information currently, because you said that you are a practitioner.
Yeah.
And for you, it is important not just to do the research, but to implement it in practice.
Mm-hmm.
So do you think that currently there is a shortage of proper delivery of the scientific information, transforming it into practice?
Yeah. That is a big challenge for science, of course, and to transfer their knowledge and their findings into practical implementation. It is not, I told you that the slogan of Wageningen University is science for impact. So, and that was also part of the work I did, is to translate scientific research into practical application. And what you of course see is that the scientific world and the scientists are living in their bubble, and practitioners in their bubble, and the link between them is quite often lacking. Which counts also, by the way, between the bubble of the politicians and the science. Also how scientific information is being transferred into political decision making is a big issue. And there's I don't know whether it is here, but there's a growing distrust in science, it seems, that people seem to start, because science has warned for the impacts of climate change for a long time, and that there's a tendency of groups of people in society that say, yeah, that's science, but do I have to believe what they are saying? That's I don't know whether you experience the same, but
Yes, I mean, we can see it currently with the COVID vaccine. I think
yeah, exactly.
what is happening, that
Yeah.
lots of people, they don't trust.
Yeah,
They don't trust the vaccine, they don't trust the science, they
Yeah.
think that what scientists say are not true. They don't
Yeah.
trust the politicians, after all, who are
Yeah.
trying to implement the vaccination. But that's other topic. Let's
yeah, no,
not
that's
go
true.
into
That's true.
that.
That's true. That's true. But yeah, that mistrust in science is, I think, it can partly be solved to prove that new technology being developed, or new insights being developed in science, that we can apply that in practical situations, that it improves the lives of us as citizens, and that is, I think, a very important task of kind of intermediate organizations, training institutes, and so on, to translate scientific research into practical application. Yeah.
And then the last but not least, I would like to ask your advice, as our channel called GreenAdvisor. So your advice for the people who are watching this, maybe related to the conservation of water, of wetlands, as the citizen, as the civilian, what can they do personally?
I don't want to be a priest, because you quickly turn to be a priest if you are saying you have to reduce your water use, and you have to buy products that are sustainably grown, and you have to cut flying with airplanes and so on. I think everyone needs to decide for him or herself what contribution you can make. But one thing is, for me, is very clear, is that the threats that are lingering above us, stemming from climate change, if we really are willing to stop the disastrous increase of the temperatures, and only a 0.1 increase of temperature has already a big impact, then we will drastically have to change our lifestyle and our way of living, and even our economy. And that is hard. That's a difficult story to tell. That's why so many people say, well, it will last my lifetime, and I don't care. Because changing your lifestyle, giving up your privilege of driving cars, eating meat, and traveling and going on holidays by airplane 3 times a year, is difficult. And but again, if we are serious about addressing the issue of climate change, we will have to change our lifestyle. And what you can do as a person, it depends on each person, individual's situation. I'm convinced that there's also a movement to say, okay, you have to wait for political changes. But political changes don't come by itself. They start at a personal level. And I think changing your personal behavior as much as possible, and that is for every person is different, but I'm convinced that eating less meat is a contribution you can make, and not starting with maybe 2 times a week instead of 7 times a week. Being conscious about the way you travel, taking public transport instead of traveling by car, or taking a bicycle if that's a possibility. But it's not, I mean, every situation offers different options, of course. Mm-hmm. But as long as you're conscious about the impact your behavior has on the emission of CO2 and the impact it has on climate change, I think that's a start already. Being conscious about your behavior is the best thing you can do. And so there's no clear guidance for how to behave, but every person needs to decide for him or herself.
Thank you very much for this very interesting conversation with us today. It was a really pleasure to have you here as my guest. And thank you for watching. If you like this video, put likes under it and write in the comments how you personally think that we should preserve the wetlands, how you are doing it in your country. And if you are interested, you can connect anytime, either me or Henk, for our advices. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Aleksandra. It was a great pleasure. Thank you.